Hi, and welcome to another Excel demo with Rich Kerr. In this scenario, we're going to take a look at how we can use the timeline and slicer components to make working with a pivot table very easy and straightforward. Now, before we implement those two components, let's just take a quick look at our source data. I have a sheet called orders that has information like order ID and date. We have a column that I won't be using. There we go. We have customer, we have sales rep, variety of data points that we might want to analyze. And there's almost 10,000 rows of data. Okay. So to create the pivot table, again, why don't we just walk through that step? So in case you haven't done that before, I'll walk you through the step of creating the basic pivot table. So we go to the Insert tab of our ribbon. You want to make sure you're clicked on a single cell anywhere in your data set. And the leftmost icon on the pivot table, on the Insert tab, is labeled Pivot Table. So we'll click it, confirm that your data is on this sheet called Orders, cell A1 through M9995. And we want our pivot table to come out onto a new worksheet. So basically, you can accept all the defaults here and choose OK. So let's say I want to look at total sales, let's say by customer. So I'm going to click on my customer field. So all those columns from their source data end up as pivot table fields. So it will list them and it'll also alphabetize them automatically. That's just something that happens normally with the pivot table process. Then I'll add, say, sales. And because that field is numeric, it shows up in the values section, and the default behavior is that the pivot table tool is summing those values. Now, I'd like them to show up in the accounting style format, so I'll right click on one of those entries and choose number format, not format cells, but rather number format. I'll go with accounting and click OK. Now, maybe I'll add another slice to this. Maybe I'll add or another component. Maybe I'll add, say, let's do sales rep. Well, that's a big list, right? So we've got the sales rep within each customer. That's a little bit longer than I want to deal with right now. Let me take sales rep out. How about segment? There we go. So I've got a field called segment, and I'm going to move that over to the columns area. So we have this segment called bulk, online, and retail, and then we have these different customers. Okay. Well, let's take a look a little bit at what we can do with what's called a slicer. So while clicked inside the pivot table, I'm going to choose Insert Slicer, and I can use any one of the fields. In fact, I'll go with one of the fields that's in the pivot table, though that's not required. I'll do the customer field. And so I now get this panel that allows me to filter my data. And I'm going to set the number of columns for my slicer to, we'll do 3. So it's a 3-column slicer. So now if I just want to see the sales to Mariano's, I click Mariano's and it filters the pivot table. Now you can use your control key to select multiple items like that, or you can turn on the multi-select option that lets you simply click to toggle an item off or on. The slicer tool has its own ribbon when it's clicked on for choosing styles. So you can apply a given style to your slicer to adjust the look and feel. And this icon in the upper right hand corner clears the filter so that all the data is shown. Now when I click back in the pivot table, let's say we had that huge list of sales reps, and maybe I don't want to put them in the pivot table because it's just so large, but I'd like to be able to filter the data for certain sales reps. So I'm going to go back to Pivot Table Analyze, or if you have a slightly older version of Excel, it'll say Pivot Table Tools with an Analyze tab underneath. In either case, the ribbon contents are the same. Let's click on Insert Slicer again, and this time I'll choose Sales Rep and click OK. So I now have a sales rep slicer, and maybe I'll make this one about 5 columns wide. And we can see, boy, that is a large list of data, all right? I mean, no matter how many columns I make it, it's really large. but it will still work. So let's say, for example, I just wanted to see sales by Chad McGuire. Well, that's it. I clicked on Chad's name in my slicer, and now that's Chad's sales. Okay. And again, I think this particular column is just so massive, it kind of defeats what I'm trying to demonstrate here. So I'm going to remove this slicer. Simply right-click and choose Remove. Maybe I'll do State. There we go. So rather than putting state into the pivot table, we know there's going to be 50 states. So I don't put the state field in the pivot table, but I can do a slicer with it. So we'll say State, click OK, and we know there's only 50 states. So if I do, say, a 5-column pivot table, it's only going to be so big, right? So now I can easily go to any given state just like that. And just like with the customer slicer, I can turn on the multi-select. So let's say I want to do just Midwest. I can just turn on my multi-select and pick those states that we're going to consider as being part of the Midwest. Okay, so that's kind of how that slicer functionality works. Even if the field is not being represented in the pivot table, you can use it to filter the data. Now, another component that's really powerful is something called the timeline. The slicer's been around for a while. Timeline only for a couple of versions of Excel, maybe going back to Excel 2010. Here's how it works. We'll click inside the pivot table and back to Pivot Table Analyze or Pivot Table Tools, and then Analyze under that. And right by where you found the Insert Slicer icon, you'll find Insert Timeline. Now, this tool will scan your source data to determine if you have any columns made up of dates. And we have one column that contains only dates, and it's called Order Date. So I'll choose the checkbox next to Order Date and choose OK. And you now get this horizontal tool that allows you to segment the data initially based on a given month. So let's say I just wanted to see what happened in, say, September of 2015. Well, there I am. And now I can start asking questions like, what happened to online sales to Walgreens in September of 2015? You can also use this bar to stretch and extend the reach of the filter. So you can, first of all, you can move it, or you can just change its dimensions. You can change its width. Now you can also change the scope. Instead of maybe using months on your timeline, perhaps you'd like to use quarters. So if I go to quarters, I can select a quarter at a time. And again, we can see the data is adjusting. And I can also, again, stretch the breadth of the selection bar to select more quarters. You can go to years. So I can look at a given year or a couple of years at once. And you can even get as granular as doing specific days. So if I go to days, now every day from the source data is represented. So if someone says, hey, how did we do that 1 week back in, say, August of 2015? I can say, oh, okay, August 1st through the 7th of 2015, and there's the data. So the timeline tool makes it very easy to segment or filter your pivot table data based on a date range. And so now with this slicer, or rather timeline and 2 slicers, I've got a very convenient way to filter my data, pardon me, and only show a subset of it at any given time. The slicer tool, the timeline tool, just like the slicers, also has styles. So you can go in and pick a given style for any one of the timelines that you have and just sort of adjust the look and feel. That's it. That's slicers and timelines being used with the Pivot Table tool. Thanks for checking in, and please check in again soon for more Excel demos with Rich Kerr. Have a productive day.